Hi everyone, this is Matthew Jenner for Card Runners, and I'm here with the theory behind advanced bet sizing, part 3. So we have a few goals for this video. The first is to talk about the river bet sizing formula. I'm going to mention where it comes from, what its limitations are, and how useful it is. Then we're going to go over tons of bet sizing examples. We're going to discuss when to overbet the river, when to bet pretty small, and the difference between in position and out of position bets. So I've mentioned before in the past that it's really important to understand when to bet big, because the difference in EV between betting like half pot and 1.5 pot size bets can be huge. Whereas if you're not that good at betting small, which is typically harder to do, it's not usually as important because the EV between, betting 0.5 pot size bets and betting 0.35 pot size bets isn't going to be that big a deal. So we're especially going to focus on the overbet aspect because that's more important. The one other thing I want to mention before we jump into this video is we're not going to discuss in detail like why a lot of people get confused about what a value bet is and how on the river, especially when you're out of position, you can bet a hand, for value expecting to lose when called. That stuff's discussed a lot in other places, especially in the 2+2 book I wrote, Applications of No Limit Hold'em. So just know we're not going to be discussing that stuff here. We're really going to focus on bet sizing when we are betting in this video, not over a lot of the things people can get confused with what the term value bet means on the river. Where to find the formula? So first you can check out pages 154 to 155 in Mathematics of Poker by Bill Chen and Jared Ankenman to see how this formula is derived. I hope I didn't mispronounce his last name. This book was way ahead of its time, and this formula wasn't discussed nearly enough. So this, in my opinion, is one of the most useful pieces of information from the book Mathematics of Poker. And it's something that you just didn't really see discussed very much, even though it's been around for a long time. Really, really good players have known about it, but it's just not something that's widely discussed because it's a little hard to implement, and because Mathematics of Poker was just so ahead of its time, a lot of times the really advanced stuff got ignored. In Applications of No Limit Hold'em, I derived a similar, though it's pretty much the same formula in a slightly different way. This formula I think is a little bit easier for me to use, and it's one I feel more comfortable talking about. So that's the formula we're going to use here, and that's in pages 339 to 346 of the book, and that will explain exactly where it comes from. So this is the formula. 0 equals 1 minus 2y times 1 plus 2x plus x squared, where x is our bet size in terms of pot size bets, and y is how often we effectively lose. And the term effectively lose is very important here. We're not going to discuss how to derive the formula, but it's important to know its limitations. And we also are going to discuss in detail what effectively lose means. So what does it mean to effectively lose? We effectively lose in one of two ways. We bet and are called and lose, or we bet and our opponent raises with a balanced range, which turns our hand into a bluff catcher. In this situation, calling and folding both have an EV of 0, so we have effectively lost. Imagine we always fold when facing a raise, since both calling and folding have 0 EV and folding is lower raise. Okay, so all this means is, let's imagine you're betting the river and you're out of position. If you bet the river and your opponent calls, you just lost your bet and you lost the pot. That's easy enough. Everyone's used to that happening. But if you're bet folding on the river, which is something that's very common to do with a value betting hand on the river, right? When you're betting on the river, most of your betting range needs to be value hands. So if your opponent raises, you have to fold a lot of your value bets in order for everything to theoretically make sense. If you're not folding some value hands on the river, your opponent's never going to bluff. He would just call. So when you bet that river and your opponent raises, if your opponent's balanced, you're almost always, or I shouldn't say almost always, the vast majority of your value betting range will then become a bluff catcher because your opponent will be raising with a very polarized range of like nut type hands in air. And then both the EV of calling and the EV of folding are both 0 if your opponent's balanced. So you effectively lost when that happens, since you bet, you face the raise, and you don't care if you call, you don't care if you fold, you have 0 EV either way. So it's best to just assume you were bet folding because that makes it a little bit easier to visualize. So when you're bet folding a hand on the river, you lose in one of two ways. Number 1 is you face a raise. Number 2 is you call and lose. So this results in us effectively losing to our opponent's bluffs, provided his range is balanced. So this is the really key part here. So let's just put some numbers on it real quick. If I bet the river my opponent might call, and when he calls, let's say I lose 30% of the time. But he also raises. And when he's raising, my opponent's raising, 80% value raises and 20% bluffs, so his range is balanced. Usually when people raise on the river, they can have very few bluffs because they're getting such a good price to call. Well, we effectively lose to our opponent's bluffs when he raises them because we're going to end up folding, or if we do end up calling, our overall EV is 0. So we've, effectively lost. So because when we face that raise, our EV is 0, we've effectively lost. So it's important to realize that when we do face a raise from our opponent, he's able to sort of beat us with some bluffs that are in a balanced range. And now someone might say, well, what if we decide to bet call on the river? Well, again, we can bet call, but our EV of calling is still going to be 0. Now there's just going to be a lot more variance. So it would still give you the same result, but it's just much easier to visualize bet folding because that just showcases how calling and folding have 0 EV, and it's easy to calculate. Okay, so let's first discuss some problems with the bet sizing formula. So there's a few major ones. The first is it doesn't take into account removal effects, which can be a pretty big deal in some spots. So that's just something you want to be aware of, and I'm going to talk about it when we do bet sizing examples, and it's talked about in more detail in the book, which is just your removal effects on certain boards matter a lot, whereas in others they don't matter much at all. But everyone kind of knows the example where if you have like a full house of, let's say the board's like King 7 3 2 2, and you have pocket kings, the bet sizing formula might tell you to make a massive river bet, but clearly that's not going to work there when you block 2/3 of your opponent's kings. Overbet's not going to probably be very effective there. And how often we effectively lose will change based on our bet sizing. So if we go all in, we only lose to hands our opponent has we only lose to hands our opponent has that beat us. So that's something that's easy to visualize. If you go all in on the river, then if we look for the two criteria that, cause us to effectively lose, number one is our opponent calls and beats us. Number two is he raises. Well, if we go all in, he can't raise. So if we go all in, our opponent can't raise, and we only lose to hands that beat us. Yet if we bet small, not only can our opponent call and beat us, but he can also raise and beat us, and within that raising range, there'll be some bluffs. So because of that, we're going to lose a little bit more often when we bet small. Because if we go all in, we only lose to the hands that have us beat. Whereas if we bet really small, we lose to the hands that have us beat when they raise and when they call, and we also lose to some bluffs that are raised in a balanced range. So because of this, as we bet smaller, we are going to effectively lose more often, but it's often not a very significant change, which is why the formula will still work really well. It doesn't take into account betting in position reopens the betting, while betting out of position does not. So this is super important. So I've talked a lot in other videos about how if you bet one big blind when you're out of position on the river, or if you check when you're out of position on the river, there's very little difference. Checking when you're out of position is kind of just like you bet 0. And the difference between betting 0 big blinds and betting 1 big blinds is going to be insignificant. When you're in position, that's not the case at all. Because when you're in position in check, no more betting. The hand's over. Whereas when you're in position and bet, you reopen up the betting. So when you're out of position, in theory, there's probably actually going to be a lot of spots where you make really, really, really small river bets. Whereas when you're in a position, I don't think you're ever going to want to bet like 5 or 10% of the pot when you're in position on the river because you're getting such little money into the pot while reopening up the betting. So just be aware of that. This formula doesn't really take that into account, and I'm going to showcase that with an example in just a second. But this formula is not – the formula won't tell you whether or not checking or betting is more profitable in position because it's not able to take into account that when you check and you're in position, the hand ends, and when you bet, you reopen up the betting. So let's showcase that. And as you're about to see, betting small and losing to the opponent's check raise bluff is terrible. Reopening up the betting in position. Quickly imagine betting 0.3 pot size bets on the river for value, since after all, small bets can make sense. And just a quick reminder, if you're betting 0.3 pot size bets on the river, you're going to have to be value betting the vast, vast majority of the time because you give your opponent such a good price. So when you bet 0.3 pot size bets, that's usually going to be consisting of a range that's mostly value hands that aren't all that strong and a couple bluffs. Well, if you bet this small in position, you reopen up the betting and a few things can happen. The first is villain folds. So in this case, if villain folds, the EV of checking and betting was the same. You just win the pot Because there's no way your opponent's going to fold a hand that beats your value bets. So if you bet and he folds, it wouldn't have mattered if you checked or bet. You were just going to win the pot. The ideal outcome is villain calls and we win. So then we ship the extra 0.3 pot size bets because we won 0.3 pot size bets more than we would have if we would have checked. So even though, the EV, I guess our total money won on the river was 1.3 pot size bets, relative to checking, we just won 0.3 pot size bets more. The third outcome is villain calls and we lose. So then we just lost 0.3 pot size bets more than we would have if we checked because we just lost our bet. The fourth option is villain value check raises. All right, so if we bet fold the river, and remember, once we bet and we face a check raise, if our opponent's balanced, we're indifferent to calling or folding, so we just assume we fold, so we have 0 variance and 0 EV. So if villain value check raises, that means he has us beat, so we lost 0.3 pot size bets more than we would have if we bet. The fifth option is villain check raise bluffs and we fold. Oh snap, we not only lose 0.3 pot size bets, but we also lost the pot we would have won if we checked. So that's a difference of 1.3 pot size bets. So really realize how significant this is. Because if you work out the math for whether or not you should make a really small river value bet in position, you're going to see that if your opponent can check raise bluff you almost ever, the small river value bet is not going to be very effective. Because it's so bad when you bet fold and your opponent was bluffing. Because again, when we bet 0.3 pot size bets, sometimes we're just going to lose because he calls. So we're going to have to win when he calls so much more than we lose when he calls in order to make up for the times that our opponent does check raise bluff all in and we end up folding and then we lost 1.3 pot size bets more than we would have if we checked. So very, very hard to bet small in position on the river. Betting small out of position does not have this problem since the opponent can make us indifferent with his balanced betting range after we check anyways. So again, really, really small value bets out of position probably make a lot of sense on the river. On other streets too. I'm guessing when you're out of position, you're going to make really, really, really small bets in theory sometimes. It's just they're not that different from checking, and it's so incredibly hard, if not impossible, to figure out, if you should be donk betting super small with your entire range on the flop, that it's kind of just like, who cares? No one really deals with it as far as I know. But in position, you're just not going to usually deal with really small bet sizes. So when you use this formula, if it gives you an answer and tells you to bet really, really small and you're in a position, you're not going to want to do it because the formula is not taking into account that when you bet small, you reopen up the betting and that lets you get check raised all in. All right. So nevertheless, if we're going to bet, the formula is still quite useful. Here it is again. So there it is in all its glory. And let's use it. So let's start assuming we are out of position and effectively lose 10% of the time on the river. How big should we bet? So again, X is our bet sizing and Y is how often we're beat. So we are going to plug in 10% for Y because that's how often we're beat. Then we're going to use the wonderful world of math to simplify this and eventually get this right here. 0 equals 1 minus 0. Well, let's just simplify it further. 0 equals 0.8 minus 0.4x minus 0.2x squared. So hopefully everyone's comfortable with this algebra. All we've done is plug in 0.1 for Y and simplify it. And then now we just go online and we use a quadratic solver and it just gives us the answer. So I just Google search quadratic solver and click the first link, which apparently is math is fun. So it gets you in the right pumped attitude for math. And then we don't really do any math. We just plug in the number and it gives it to us. So anyways, make sure you're plugging in the right coefficients for the variables. So for example, our C was 0.8. That was the constant. So it's 0.8 and then minus 0.4x minus 0.2x squared. Whereas the way I wrote the formula, I have it written as, 0.8 minus 0.4x minus 0.2x squared. So just make sure that you're actually plugging in the right coefficients to however the quadratic solver you use has them listed. So in this case, I plug it in and it gives us two possible answers as you're going to get for a quadratic equation. So we either can bet 1.23 pot size bets or negative 3.23 pot size bets. So clearly, one of those doesn't make any sense. So the correct answer is we should bet 1.23 pot size bets on the river. So what did this tell us? Well, it told us if we're out of position and only effectively lose 10% of the time, we should bet 1.23 pot size bets. This makes sense, especially since one pot size bet will be optimal when we're beat exactly 12.5% of the time. So you can see me plugging these variables right here. And you can plug it in for yourself, and you'll see that the answer is 1. You should bet 1 pot size bet when you're bet 12.5% of the time. So here, we're beat only 10% of the time. So we're going to bet a little bit bigger than we would if we were beat 12.5% of the time. So it makes sense that we want to bet bigger than the pot. We want to bet 1.23 pot size bets. What I want to mention also, though, is even though we're talking about how like this formula isn't perfect, there's all these little minor flaws in it, it's pretty much an awesome formula. So you're not going to want to just recklessly use this and recklessly bet 1.23 pot size bet when you're beat 10% of the time. But it's going to be a really good formula when you're in position and when you're out of position, especially in spots where your opponent's just very, very unlikely to raise. And usually if you're beat only, 5% of the time on the river, it's going to be very, very unlikely you get raised. So again, acknowledge the formula's limitations. You can read more about it in other books, but for the most part, even though it's not perfect, it's a really, really good formula. All right, so whether to bet in position is more complicated. I'm not going to repeat this too much. We've already pretty much discussed it. If our opponent only defends by calling and he only has a speed 10% of the time, then sure, we should bet exactly 1.23 pot size bets. But if we're super freaking deep and our opponent not only defends by calling, but will also check raise bluff, then this won't be the optimal sizing. Again, it gets more complicated, but hopefully you understand the general idea. The more the opponent can check raise all in after we open up the betting, the worse this formula will be for solving the optimal bet sizing. So now I'd highly recommend you play around with the formula a bit, because if you're like most players, you're probably just used to betting like 60% of the pot on the river. And if you play around with the formula a bit, you're probably going to realize that that sizing sucks a lot of the time. Like there's a lot of times when you should be betting huge, a lot of times where you can bet smaller than that when you're out of position. And again, you might not bet like drastically smaller than that, but there are going to be times when you should be betting 30 or 40% of the pot rather than 60% of the pot. So play around with the formula and get a feel for, how big you should bet based on how often you're beat. Be sure to notice we can still overbet if the situation calls for it and we're beat less than 12.5% of the time. So don't be afraid to overbet because you can sometimes be beat. And on this note, before I move to the next slide, a lot of times you want to remember, I think your brain is going to tell you you did something wrong if you overbet and your opponent, snap calls you with the nuts. But, at the end of the day, if you're overbetting, it's usually a spot where your opponent can't have many strong hands and you're usually betting, your really, really good hands if you're value betting. So if your opponent ends up having a super strong hand that you don't think is in his range or you don't think he has very many, and you have one of the really strong hands in your range, you're going to get stacked either way almost every single time. So just because you overbet sometimes you get shown a better hand, it doesn't mean you need to be scared to do it because honestly, you're probably going to get stacked either way. Okay, so let's start doing some examples. So for these hand examples, we're not going to be able to get perfect bet sizing. So we're just going to go over some hand examples and talk about what sort of bet sizing seems reasonable. Our job is not to be anal about trying to find the perfect bet sizing for one spot. It's to sort of just discuss different spots to overall improve our game and get closer to what looks optimal-ish. It's not to get perfect in a specific spot. So we're not going to solve for the exact sizing. It's not realistic and it's not practical. So it is useful. It's useful to use the formula once in a while if you think, okay, I'm beat this often on the river. Let me get a feel for how big I should bet. But again, the formula doesn't work perfectly. There's removal effects. It's important we understand these things, and that's what we're going to talk about a lot. So let's go. All right. So we open in the cutoff with ace-king suited and the button calls. The flop comes ace-9-5 rainbow. We bet 60% of the pot, and the opponent calls. The turn comes to 3 diamonds. We again bet 60% of the pot, and the opponent calls. And the turn completed the rainbow. The river card comes to 10 of spades. How big should we bet? Well, the first thing I would do is think to ourselves, okay, let's think about how many combos which beat us. Let's ask Flopzilla, though we won't get an exact answer. Let's put in a button flatting range and see how often we're beat. So you can do that, but even off the top of your head, you should probably have a good sense of what types of hands your opponent can have in this situation that beats ace-king suited. So you can pause for a moment and then write it down or think to yourself and see if we agree. So do that now if you want to pause, but I think we lose to pocket 9s, pocket 5s, pocket 10s, and ace-10 suited for 11 combos total. And I also assume he'll be able to raise almost all those on the river, which might let him bluff another 4 combos. So we'll effectively lose to 4 more combos or 15 combos total. So since the board's rainbow here, I think it's pretty easy for the opponent to have Pocket nines, pocket fives, pocket tens, and then ace 10 suited. If you disagree, then you can plug in a different number, but it seems reasonable-ish enough to me, and that means we're beat by 15 combos on the river. So here is a button versus cutoff flatting range that I just made up right now. No one knows what the optimal button versus cutoff flatting range is, so feel free to choose whatever range you think is best. And here, there were 138 combos on this board texture in the button flatting range for the range I gave him. So if he defends 65% of his flop range to a c-bet, then he's going to have 90 combos on the turn. And if he defends another 65% of his turn range to a c-bet, he's going to have 58 combos on the river. So if he has 58 combos on the river and we're beaten 15 by 15 combos, then we can say 15 divided by 58, we effectively beat on this river 25.9% of the time. Again, there's going to be some removal effect here. This isn't going to work absolutely perfectly, but for the most part, this is going to give you a good idea of how big we should bet the river. So now we can take the 25.9%, plug it into the formula, and get an answer for about what would look like a pretty good river sizing. So I solved this and plugged it into the quadratic solver, and for some reason it won't let me pop up this last line of text, so spoiler alerts. But let's show how we got it. So I plugged in 0.259 for y, because that's how often we're effectively beat on the river. Then I just simplified and solved. So again, be sure that you're plugging in, 0 equals 0.482 minus 1.03x minus 0.518x squared. Make sure you're plugging those coefficients in the right spot when you use the quadratic solver. I've plugged it into the wrong spot many times before and then been confused. So don't repeat my mistake. Okay, so what does this formula mean? Again, we made some simplifications. We assumed our opponent was calling with, a certain range of hands on the flop and turn. We weren't able to take removal effects into account. We don't know for sure that our opponent's not having some turn raising range. We made a lot of assumptions to get here. But at the end of the day, what I would take for this isn't that this is the optimal sizing here, because we made way too many assumptions to say what's optimal. But it does kind of showcase how a smaller river bet here is probably better than a larger one. And I think I could easily make this mistake if I hadn't played around with this formula. I could think ace-king should make a large river bet without realizing, hey, wait a second. I'm actually going to get raised on this river decently often because my opponent can have so many sets as well as some ace-10 suited type hands. And even if ace-king can bet 60 or 70% of the pot on the river and still mostly win when called, we're not really looking to just win barely over half the time. We want to pick a bet sizing that allows us to win the majority of the time when we're called. In this case, at least. So here, it's more effective to bet 40% of the pot, a little less than half pot, because when we bet a little less than half pot, we make our opponent call with his ace-jack combos, all of his ace-queen combos, maybe even some ace-x suited combos. Those hands probably can't fold to a 40% pot size river bet. Otherwise, we're going to be able to profitably bluff any two cards on the river, and our opponent probably doesn't want to allow us to do that. But by the same token, if we make a 60 or 70% pot size bet on the river, not only will we lose more money to our opponent's sets, because again, when we bet and he raises, we're indifferent. So we'll have lost more money to our opponent's, hands when he bluffs or has a set. But on top of that, we probably make our opponent fold some ace-x suited hands or some ace-jack hands. And we don't really want to do that here. We want to make sure those hands call because, ace-king's the hand that beats those. So yeah, here, what I would just more of take of it, it's not going to be that this is the exact answer, but on this river, I think it's a spot where I easily could see myself betting 70% of the pot if I hadn't played with the formula, and that's probably too big. All right, so let's continue. All right, hand number 2. Button opens, we 3-bet queen-jack suited in the big blind. Button calls. So if we're 3-betting queen-jack suited in the big blind against the button, it assumes we're using, a less polarized 3-betting range, which is fine. No one knows whether or not queen-jack suited is an optimal 3-bet against the button open, but my guess is it is. All right, so here's the flop. 10 of clubs, 8 of clubs, 5 of spades. We bet, and villain calls. So check raising is probably okay too here. So on this flop, it's probably going to be a really complex situation where, you're the 3-better and the button calls and you get this 10-high coordinated board. So I could see an argument for check calling or check raising, but on this flop, I think most people that are watching this video would just choose to bet with the gut shot and overcards rather than do something fancy. So let's just assume we bet here. The villain comes the 2 of spades. We check, planning to check raise all in. Villain checks back. So make sure you're fully absorbing the board. There's 2 flush draws that are possible and a whole bunch of straights that are possible. So here we check the turn, planning to check raise all in. That's totally fine to do here. And in this case, villain just checked back. The river card comes the king of diamonds. How big should we bet? So again, pause for a moment and completely absorb the action in the board. We 3-bet pre-flop, we c-bet the flop, he called, we checked the turn, planning to check raise all in, our check raise all in failed, and then the river came the king of diamond. How big should we bet if we do decide to bet here? So the final board is 10 of clubs, 8 of clubs, 5 of spades, 2 of spades, king of diamonds. I played this exact hand and bet 0.7 pot size bets on the river, saying, well, he could have king 10, and 0.7 pot size bets looks value-y. So again, absorb what I did. And I think my bet sizing sucked. So this is a very recent hand that I played, and I felt terrible afterwards because I don't remember what I ended up getting called with, but I got called by some random hand. I don't know if it was a 10 or a king or whatever. But my bet sizing sucks here because if I'm value betting this river, for the most part, I'm going to be value betting like king, queen, and ace, king hands. You know, maybe you could get tricky with some weaker kings that wouldn't want to overbet. But for the most part, if I have king, queen, or ace, king, how am I beat on this river? My opponent would have had to have checked back a really strong hand on the 10 of clubs, 8 of clubs, 5 of spades, 2 of spades board, which is insanely risky, so I doubt he'd do that. And at the end of the day, I am just not beat here often enough to justify betting small. He has 2 combinations of king 10 suited, and the rest of his range is a bluff catcher to my ace, king, and king, queen. This is a great example of me putting one hand in my opponent's range, which can be nutted, and making a terrible bet sizing with weak justification. So I think this hand's really important. And if you're like me, a lot of times, even if you understand a concept, you'll often have to misplay something once or twice before you really make sure you don't make that mistake again. And this is just a good example of me being able to pick a single nut type hand in his range, which is pretty much king 10 suited for 2 combos. And then because of that, me going, oh no, wait, he can be nut, or he can have a nut type hand here, I shouldn't overbet. He doesn't have it nearly enough to stop me from overbetting. And at the end of the day, it's very hard to not have some contradiction in my logic if I don't think overbetting is going to be good here either for value or for a bluff. Because on one hand, if I think my opponent's going to just call my river a bunch because it looks, my river overbet looks full of crap, then obviously I'm going to want to value bet ace, king, and king, queen all in here for value. Likewise, if I think my opponent's going to realize just how much money I'm risking if I make a 2-pot size bet on the river, and I think he's just going to end up folding with like all of his 10x, all of his, if he can have pocket jacks, if he has pocket nines, if he has any sort of weaker king x, then if I think he's going to just fold there because he's going to always put me on like ace king or a hand that missed the check raise all in on the turn. That's something else that's important to realize here, which is if I check this turn and my opponent checks back, it's harder for him to have a nut type hand on the river than me because maybe I was check raising all in on the turn with a set or an overpair. Whereas my opponent probably would just never check back on this board. Like, it's just so coordinated with 2 flush draws, and the board's only 10 high. So because of that, I can just represent a lot of nut type hands, so it makes sense for me to make a massive bet. So yeah, this is a hand that I think I really misplayed, and I understand the theory behind bet sizing. I was just playing, you have to make decisions quickly, and the mistake I made here is I was able to find one nut type hand in the opponent's range, and I allowed that to stop me from overbetting. Whereas if you use the formula, you can see that if my opponent has a nut type hand 5 or 6% of the time on the river, that's nowhere near often enough to stop me from making a massive bet here. So hand 2 continued. What should I have bet? Well, I probably should have gone all in for 2 pot size bets or whatever. Remember, we only have queen high, and on the board, there's not that many hands in our range that are, worse than queen high. And, it's hard to tell the removal effect of queen jack. Like, maybe it blocks some of our opponents' king, queen, and king jack, but we don't know how often he bets them on the turn. But at the end of the day, we have queen high. It looks like a good bluff, and I think we probably should have gone all in for 2 pot size bets or whatever I had left. And also, remember, even if we have ace king and our opponent has us beat, like he has king 10 or he did slow play a set on the turn, we're going to lose our stack anyways. So what's important to remember is, when you make a really big bluff, you're going to have lost more money than you would have if you bluff small. But when you have a value hand and you're making a really, really big value bet, like if I'm value betting ace king all in here for 2 pot size bets, don't beat yourself up if you get called and lose, because you're going to lose your entire stack anyways. So over betting maximizes my value and lets me bluff most aggressively. So cool. Even if I bet, and the other thing too is, even if I bet huge, I still have to have ace king and queen king more often than not. Players often get this mixed up. So it's easy to mentally play tricks on yourself. So make sure you can answer these questions. And my guess is, even if you're a really good player that's watching this, it's going to take you a moment to get the right answer, or you might even get it wrong. So let's do it real quick. If I bet 2 pot size bets on the river, so if I go all in here for 2 pot size bets, Do I have to have more value hands, or should there be more value hands or more bluffs in my range? So pause for a moment and think. And the answer is there should be, I think we already talked about it earlier, there should be more value hands. Like our opponent's still risking 2 pot size bets to win 3 pot size bets, so we still need to be value betting more often than not. Even by a reasonably significant amount if we're betting like 1.5 pot size bets on the river. But if we're betting 2 pot size bets on the river, how often does our opponent need to call? Well, since we're betting 2 pot size bets, we're risking 2 pot size bets to win 1 pot size bet, so our opponent only has to call a third of the time to make us indifferent to bluffing. So when we overbet, our opponent's not going to be calling all that often, but we still need to have most of our hands be value bets. And then when we do get called, since we're usually betting like nuts or air on the river, we just win a ton of money when our value bets get called. So yeah, so don't get this confused. Even though we are going to have a lot of ace, king, and queen, king on the river, we probably still can't bluff any 2 cards in our range, even with the big, giant, massive overbet. All right, so welcome to Closer to GTO Poker. It's aggressive and it's high variance. It's just the way games are going to keep progressing as people get better and better is you're just going to have to be willing to make very large bets, and sometimes you're going to have lost a stack that you would not have lost if you made a normal, less close to theoretically optimal bet. One last thing I want to mention about this hand before I move on, and it has to deal with like a contradiction in your thought process. I'd be okay with a player that says something like, you know what, on this river, they only want to overbet bluff because they think it looks so strong and their opponents are just going to fold too much. And then when they want value, they're going to bet 0.7 pot size bets, like I mistakenly bet here, because then the opponent ends up calling with this like jack 10 or pocket 9s or whatever. That's okay to exploitatively think those things, but you got to make sure there's no contradiction in your thought process. So it'd be very hard to not have to argue why you shouldn't have an overbetting range here. So if you want to only overbet for value or only overbet bluff exploitatively, that can be best. But you're probably going to need to do one or the other. It's probably impossible for you to successfully argue there's no hands that should overbet here. It'd be very, very hard to do. And at the end of the day, it's also one of those things where, you know, different people have different feelings, but most people probably tend to overestimate their exploitative abilities. So if you just play this really solid GTO strategy where you're overbetting for value and you're overbet bluffing, you're going to end up winning money no matter what. So be aware you can, you know, do that exploitative thing where you're only overbetting for either value or for bluffs if you think you can exploit your opponent, but you want to be really careful with that. So hand number 3, we open in the cutoff in the button calls. The flop comes ace, 9, 3 rainbow. We bet the flop for 65% of the pot and our opponent calls. All right, pretty normal there. So we just see bet a dry board. The turn comes the 8 of spades. We bet 0.65 pot size bets and our opponent calls. Okay, cool. Another normal size bet. And of course we want to bet normal size on the turn. When we do bet, we wouldn't want to overbet this turn because our opponent would have slow played like his pocket 9s and pocket 3s if he could have them. And he probably can have pocket 8s too. So I don't think a big bet on this turn would be very effective. The river comes the 4 of diamonds. So pretty much another blank. Which hands make good overbets and which hands make good small bets? So look at the board. The board was ace, 9, 3, 8 of spades on the turn, and then a 4 of diamonds on the river. And think to yourself which hands make good overbets and which hand make good small bets. And again, it's really important to keep in mind, even if you can overbet on the river, that doesn't mean you're always going to overbet when you do bet. You'll still use multiple sizings. It's especially important exploitatively. It's very easy to bet like certain sizing with certain hands and not really get exploited by it unless you're playing, you know, pretty high limits on really tough sites. So let's ask the obvious question. If we bet a reasonable size at 0.65 pot size bet on the river, is our opponent ever going to raise us? So probably not, because the board was ace of spades, 9 of clubs, 8 of spades, 3 of diamonds on the turn. That's a reasonably hard board for him to slow play. Now, when I say it's reasonably hard to slow play, I don't mean it's like this impossible spot for him to slow play. But he's taking a pretty big risk by slow playing if he has like pocket 9s, pocket 8s, or pocket 3s there. Or if he has like ace 9 or ace 8 suited. Because when he does slow play, we have a bunch of flush draws in our range, and we can easily have jack 10, 7, 6, 4, 5 for straight draws. And what's important to keep in mind is when our opponent slow plays here, is not only can we outdraw him with some hands in our range, but he might also just lose action. So if our opponent has, let's say, pocket 9s on the turn, sometimes we're going to have pocket 3s. And if he just calls, and the river card comes like a 4 of spades or something like that, or if the river card, let's say, comes a 10 of spades, that's an even better example. So let's say the river card comes a 10 of spades, then he's just lost a ton of action. So even though it was pocket 9s versus pocket 3s, he had us overset on the flop, even though, we didn't outdraw him on the river, he still lost a ton of action. So it's just so hard to slow play because you can just so easily lose action and easily be outdrawn on these boards. Hand number 3. So don't get me wrong, I'm sure you'll sometimes get raised on this river as you see way crazier plays than that from Riggs every now and then. And again, I'm not even saying it's theoretically bad for the opponent to slow play on the turn. I just don't think he should do it at a very high frequency. And I'll be honest with you, there's very few people I'd want to slow play on that turn against because few people overbet the river when you do slow play. So it's just not usually worth the risk of being sometimes outdrawn. So, even though it can be okay to slow play in theory, probably, because GTO poker uses a lot of mixed strategies. So maybe, you call with pocket nine sometimes and you raise them sometimes. In reality, I would never slow play that. And I think most rigs are the same. But remember, even if we do have a premium hand like ace king on the river, if our opponent has us beat, we're probably going to get stacked anyways. So don't feel too bad if you get stacked after overbetting. I think that sentence came out pretty poorly, so I rewrote it, and I'm going to say it once more. But remember, even if our premium hand is beaten, so let's say we have ace king and our opponent has us beat, we're probably going to get stacked anyways. So don't feel too bad if you get stacked after overbetting, because if you would have bet smaller, he would have raised, you probably would have had to call and lost it all anyways. All right, so hand number 3. What I do here if I was trying to play GTO-ish, I'd likely overbet all in with hands which are ace king plus. Overbetting all in might be a little bit too extreme, actually. So I should say overbet. If you have a lot of stack depth here, especially, like if you made a relatively small open pre-flop, and then we only bet like 65% on the flop or turn, overbetting all in is probably a little bit too extreme. So I should just say I'd likely overbet with hands that are ace king plus. Even overbetting all in might not be too crazy, but I don't think you would want to make your bet that big there. Otherwise, your opponent will have a clear incentive to slow play his nut type hands on the turn. So let me make sure I have that really clear. If we actually knew our ace king and better was never beat on the river, then yeah, we would probably overbet it. But because if we are overbetting all in here, if we're making like a 3 times pot size bet on the river when we get a river blank, then our opponent should slow play all of his sets on the turn because he gets to win such a massive bet from our ace king and some of our bluffs on the river. So in theory here with ace king or better, make an overbet, but it probably doesn't need to be all in. Bet smaller with ace queen, and the reason for that is ace queen is going to be splitting. So ace queen doesn't just always win, it ends up splitting, which you can try to take into account with the formula we talked about earlier because, it's like if you split 10% of the time on the river, it's almost kind of like you lost 5% of the time because, you just, rather than, if you lost 10% of the time, you'd have lost, 10 times. Whereas if you split 10% of the time, it would have been the same as if you won 5% more and lost 5% more. So splitting is, you can take it into account with the formula, but for the most part, just conceptually, if we're going to split on the river, we don't want to make a massive bet here with ace queen, because if we do, we're going to make our opponent fold all of his, ace jack or any other ace x suited hands he can have. He's going to fold that all to our big bet, and we just end up splitting. So we're going to bet smaller with ace queen. And then we're going to bet smaller still with ace jack, because not only does ace jack split with ace jack, but it also loses now to ace queen. So right here, if you just look at what I wrote, it's really kind of simple. All it is saying is, hey, if it's a spot where it's really hard for me to be beat on the river, I'm going to, with my nut type hands, make large bets because those require my opponent to put the most money in the pot on average. And then I'm going to make smaller bets with hands that can be beaten more often. Yeah, like that's it. And then I probably checked ace 10 or worse at some point. So if I had ace 10 or ace x suited, I probably just wouldn't be betting the river. All right. Technically, you need to balance the ace-jack betting range with some premium hands, or else your opponent can always jam with ace-jack and better since he knows he can't be beat. So imagine if on the river I'm literally just betting with ace-jack and air, like really small. Well, in that case, if you know I'm betting really small against you with ace-jack and air, you would never call my bet with your ace-queen or ace-jack because you can just free roll by raising all in with them. So because of that, I would technically need to balance that small betting range with ace-jack. Because if I'm playing against you and I'm only betting just ace jack and air, you're going to be raising me with all those hands. But if I start betting, smaller with some ace king or better as well, then that's going to make you unable to raise me as effectively with your ace jack or ace queen because now my small betting range includes a lot of ace jack, a little bit of air, and a little bit of premium hands, and it's very risky for you to raise, with your ace jack or ace queen because then you end up getting stacked by my premium hands. So just be aware of this. You would technically need to balance these small betting ranges. But in reality, I think it's quite unlikely most players watching this are going to play against opponents where balancing the small betting range is much of an issue. It takes some testicular fortitude to value raise ace-queen all in on the river. Like, I mean, really think about how much balls it takes to be like, you know what? I think my opponent's betting a lot of ace-jack in air. I'm going to go all in with this ace-jack and hope to blast him off a split. Like, that takes a lot of balls, and you got to be really confident with your read that your opponent's never betting better to do that with ace-jack there. So at the end of the day, I think it's just going to be a non-issue to almost anyone playing, or sorry, anyone that's watching this, because most people that are watching this aren't playing high enough limits where that's really going to be much of an issue. I personally am playing very soft tables at the moment, much softer than PokerStars, and I would never worry about balancing the small betting ranges here. I do exactly what I just said. So, it's not like I have open this formula that I'm plugging in how often I think I'm beat on the river, and then I'm trying to figure out my bet sizing based on this formula when I'm actually playing. The formula was kind of just a useful thing to play with. It taught me a lot about bet sizing, and then now when I'm playing, it's just, hey, my opponent's range is capped on the river. I'm mostly going to bet really big with my strong hands, and then if I have weaker hands, I'm going to value bet smaller. Then I'm going to bluff accordingly too. It's really just that simple, and again, if you're playing against people that are so good that you really have to worry about balancing the small betting ranges, then okay, then deal with that. But that's probably not going to apply to like 99.99% of the poker playing population. And the other thing you could do too is if you were actually playing against regs and you were worried about getting exploited, then just take a note if you ever see him like make a super thin value raise when you bet small on the river. If you see him do that, then yeah, I would take a note, and then you're going to have to start, balancing a little bit more. But until you see that, I wouldn't worry too much. Oh, and then I wrote another thing. I'm still having to force myself to overbet in some spots, but I think it's hard to justify not overbet bluffing or value betting here. So it's exactly like what I talked about in the last hand example with the king coming on the river in the 3-bet pot. A lot of times you can find a spot where you say, okay, I'm not overbetting for value and I'm not overbet bluffing. To me, that means something's probably got to be wrong. You'd probably have to make a pretty extreme situation for there not to be some contradiction in your thought process. So for a spot like this, let's go back to the board texture real quick. So for a spot like this, ace 9, 8, 3 with a 4 on the river, it's a spot where I could easily just catch myself making a normal size bet when I have a set on the river, or making a normal size bet when I have ace jack on the river. That's probably a mistake, and I should just adjust my bet sizing a little bit. And then as you get better and better, that's where you're going to start considering mistakes. Not that you missed a value bet, but that when you did value bet, you didn't use the right sizing. So we have a little bit more on this hand. So the final board is ace 9, 3, 8, 4. What hands make good overbet bluffs, and what hands make good small bluffs? So we've talked a lot about the value overbet bluffs, the value overbets, and we've talked a lot about the small value bets, but we haven't talked much about what hands make good overbet bluffs or what hands make good small bluffs. So take a moment to think about that if you want. And then the answer, or what I put is here the removal effect doesn't seem that important. The hands we'd block when bluffing our hands, the hands we'd like to block when bluffing our hands like ace queen and ace jack. So maybe king queen and queen jack could make good bluffs, but this isn't going to be a big deal. So it's a little bit of a trick question, which I sometimes do because I just don't want to make the answer so obvious if I never put anything kind of tricky in. But here, this isn't a spot where it seems like the removal effect is going to matter that much. We can't block pairs of aces, and that's normally the hands our opponent's going to call with on the river if we bet, right? His calling range mostly consists of ace queen, ace jack, ace 10. But how do we really block those hands very effectively if we're bluffing? Because what we'd want to block is the ace, but if we have an ace in our hand, we're not bluffing. So here I would just say it doesn't really look like the randomizer matters much here. The flush draw might matter a little bit, which I'll talk about in a second. But so here at the end of the day, all I would say is I don't think the randomizer matters much. Like, I would put very little effort into what hands I bluff with here. I would just kind of want to have a feel for I don't want to bluff too much or too little. And I usually allow, for example, if I'm bluff raising on the flop, I'm of course going to make sure my hand has the right qualities to justify a bluff raise. But here on the river, there's no more cards left to come. There's no big deal removal effect. I don't think it matters what hands you bluff with here. You need to bluff some hands big and some hands small if you're going to try to balance the ranges a little bit. But which hands you use isn't going to be a big deal. The exception is if we have a missed flush draw, we'll block our opponent's missed flush draws, but he'll have less than us. So maybe we should emphasize bluffing them a bit less when possible, but my guess is it hardly matters here. So if there had been a flush draw on the flop, there wasn't here. The turn brought a flush draw though. But if there had been a flush draw on the flop, then your opponent could have, called a flop bet with a flush draw and a turn bet with a flush draw. So if I myself have a flush draw, it's less likely for my opponent to have a flush draw, which means it's less likely for my bluff to succeed. Because when I do bluff the river, my opponent's going to, fold usually with his missed draws unless he bluff raises them. So the flush draw will sometimes matter on dry boards. So for example, if this flop was ace of spades, nine of spades, three of diamonds, and the turn was an offsuit 8. So if there was a flush draw on the flop, then maybe we'd be a little bit less likely to, bluff with our missed flush draws because our opponent's just going to have a few more made hands. But again, probably not that big of a deal. So let's move on to hand 4. We open in under the gun and the button calls. Flop comes queen of clubs, 7 of hearts, 3 of hearts. We bet 65% of the pot and our opponent calls. The turn comes the 2 of diamonds. We once again bet 65% of the pot and he calls. And then the river comes the 4 of hearts, giving the flush to the board. What bet sizing makes sense with what hands? So pause for a moment and think. So this spot is super tricky and I don't know the correct answer. Hands which want to overbet are strong flushes, but hands which can make high flushes usually block 2 high heart cards. So what's important to remember is when you're overbetting, if we're betting like 2 times the pot on the river, and I don't think we'd overbet that big here, but if we're betting 2 times the pot on the river, our opponent's allowed to fold so much that if we're overbetting a hand like king, queen of hearts, we're kind of taking all the hands that he would call with out of his range. So if we just make a massive, massive overbet, like it sometimes helps to imagine an extreme example. If we went all in for 1,000 pot size bets with the nut flush, our opponent would just always fold because he's just going to say like, well, the opponent would only need to call with the nuts. So the opponent would only call with the nuts, and since he can't have the nuts because we have the nuts, we don't get any value with our 1,000 pot size bet over bet. So here the removal effect is going to get really tricky because the hands that want to bet really big are blocking the hands that our opponent's going to end up calling with. So yeah, so this is what I just said. All right. So luckily we can also block the nut flush if we have a hand like ace king off or ace jack off. So knowing this, we can bluff some, ace of hearts with a rag. So we can just bluff with the nut flush blocker and balance this with our nut flush value bets. So again, it's tricky. You're not going to be able to calculate this out directly because there's way too much removal effect stuff happening here. But it's probably reasonable to make a really big bet when you have the nut flush or the nut flush blocker. But you just want to be aware of that, especially if you have the nut flush. Like, you're not going to get called at as high of a frequency as you would like because you do block some hands in the opponent's calling range. That doesn't mean an overbet's still not good. It just means, like, if we make a 2 times pot size bet on the river, our opponent is supposed to call 33.3% of the time if we ignore removal effects because we're risking 2 pot size bets to win 1 pot size bet. So we'd have to call 33% of the time to keep us indifferent to bluffing. But if we take into account blockers, he's probably going to end up even calling less than that. And that's true both when we're bluffing, when we block the ace hearts king X, and when we're just value betting. By the way, I'd really appreciate it if people want to give me feedback for when they like it if I use like tough examples. Because on one hand, I don't want to avoid tough examples because then it just makes things seem really confusing when you watch a video and play. Because, you watch a video, you probably get pumped on bet sizing. And then when you start playing, you're like, wow, this is a lot harder than I thought. So I feel like it's kind of good if I point out how difficult and intricate some spots are. But I also don't know if this kind of just annoys people because they want to get clear answers. And then whenever you talk about a complex spot, it's also more likely that I'm just wrong because you can't just like sort of solve for what's correct. You have to really try to take into a bunch of variables into account and make the best decision. So let me know if you like examples like this. We're going to talk about it some more, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. All right, so we could bet big with like the nut flushes in the nut flush blocker. So that would be the hands that bet biggest. And then we would probably bet medium with hands like kings, aces, sets, weaker flush, and of course some bluffs. And then we'd bet medium to small with like ace, queen, weaker flushes, and air. Because again, when you bet small, you're going to get raised sometimes on the river, so it helps to have some strong hands in your range, like the weaker flushes. Remember, ace, queen splits, whereas sets, kings, and aces do not, so betting smaller with ace, queen will be more effective. And I don't think I'd have bet king, queen all 3 streets, so that's why ace, queen's going to be the hand that bets the smallest. So this general idea, and this is the idea that I want most people to really absorb from this, because people try to sometimes make things more complicated than they are, but at the end of the day, you're usually just betting big with your strong hands in a bunch of bluffs. And when I say a bunch of bluffs, we're on the river, so you're still not bluffing all that often, but you can bluff at a higher frequency when you bet big. So your big betting range is your super strong hands, and then your bluffs with your good blockers or your best blockers. you bet medium with hands that aren't quite as strong, and you bet smaller with hands which aren't quite as strong still. You would technically need to balance each range, but against most opponents, at the end of the day, just even if the range isn't balanced, it's going to probably work really well. Right, so bet small with probably nothing. So the difference between betting very small and checking is usually really little. And since these ranges are so complex, I almost never bother even trying. So I mentioned that before. You will often have a very small betting range when you're out of position, but it's so hard to design those ranges, and it's so the difference is often so little between checking and betting small. I personally am not able to use them. So if you want to go bet here, your range is probably going to be pretty polarized anyways. So you might not even want a small betting range here. And the hands that might want to bet really small might be hands like king, queen, or queen, jack. But honestly, I think if you go bet with those hands, you probably made a mistake somewhere by betting flop and turn. I don't think if you're under the gun and you face a cold call, I don't think you're going to be able to bet king, queen, and queen, jack on the flop and turn. A lot of people do bet it, but I don't think that's ideal. So the hand that might want to bet really small in the river probably shouldn't even be in your range. Okay, so general rules, but don't follow them recklessly. Right now, I'm really enjoying betting small when in position on reasonably wet boards on the flop and sometimes turn. And this makes my opponent's check raises less effective and forces them to call wider and play the next street out of position. And after they call, I can consider overbetting if the following card is a blank and it's very hard for them to have me beat. So this is a general strategy I'm applying, something I didn't really understand when I was playing a couple years ago that I'm doing now and liking a lot. Which is you just get, I'm going to showcase examples in a minute, but the general idea is a lot of times you're going to be in a spot where you go, okay, my opponent can have some nut type hands in his range, so that makes me not want to bet that big because I don't want to make a really big bet with like a marginal strength hand, because if I do, I might make a lot of the hands I beat fold, and then my opponents can check raise bluff and check raise for value, and that's going to be super effective after I've already invested a lot of money in the pot. And then if our opponents can aggressively check raise, we don't even usually need to bet that big with our nut type hands, because we're still going to stack our opponent when he has like a lower set on the flop, because that's going to check raise anyways. So we can bet smaller when our opponent has a lot of nut type hands. And then if he calls, then we know his range is condensed. He doesn't have a lot of nut type hands if the turn card's blank. And then on the turn, that's when we start using multiple different sizes. So again, it's very common for me on the flop to kind of stick with like one sizing. Yeah, in theory, you'd use multiple different sizings, but on the flop, it's going to usually be around the same bet sizing, and I'm not that good where I'm betting like 0.5 pot size bets with some range and 0.6 pot size bets with others. So what I do is I have sort of one sizing on the flop, as I've talked about before, but then on the turn in the river, I'm going to use multiple sizings, especially if it was a wet board where my opponent called and the next street blanked. So more on small bets in position. The most common problem I see players have is they don't want to bet small for a few reasons. Number one is they're afraid of giving draws too good of a price, and they think it makes the hand harder to play. I believe neither of these reasons are strong justifications for refusing to make small bets. And again, when I say small bets in position, I'm usually meaning like a third pot size bet or bigger. Sometimes you can bet smaller, especially in a 3 or 4 bet pot. But I'm usually meaning not super small bets, because super small bets that reopen up the betting aren't usually going to be very effective unless our opponent's range is super polarized. So that probably sounded really confusing to people. So what that means is sometimes in position, we're going to bet really small if we know our opponent's range is just like nuts or air, because that's an effective bet size against our opponent if we don't want to give free cards. But for the most part, we have to always remember, we reopen up the betting by betting small in position. So I'm usually not going to bet if I'm going to be betting less than a third pot size bet, because at that point I'm betting so small, I'd rather just check and not reopen up the betting. So the first reason would be draws get a good price. So yeah, if we bet 40% of the pot on the turn, draws get a good price. But we'll see when the draw got there on the river, and it's very unlikely we'll overbet that river card at a high frequency, if at all. That's because each player has nut type's hands, and we don't need to overbet our flushes to stack his weaker flushes. Notice this is insane. We'll never bet large with some range, just that we won't be overbetting at a high frequency. So if we make a small bet when the board's wet on the turn, I'm not saying we can't ever overbet the river when the flush gets there. We just talked about how sometimes we'll overbet with maybe like the nut flush and the nut flush blocker. But that's not a spot where we're going to overbet at a super high frequency, because the spots that we overbet at a high frequency are just spots where it's like, oh man, my opponent just called the turn when the board was super wet, the river was a complete blank, and there's not that many complete blanks. And then, if I know my opponent's range is capped at top pair, which is a pair of tens with like an ace kicker, and I have all these all these overpairs and all these sets in my range and all these two pairs in my range, then we're going to be overbetting at a super high frequency against our opponent's capped range. Here, if we bet small on the turn and there's a draw and the draw gets there, our opponent's range isn't going to be capped. So we could still make a few really big bets, but it's going to be at a much lower frequency. And when we do it, we're usually going to have the blocker to our opponent's nut type hands. So all that's saying is if we bet small on a wet board, we know we kind of gave our opponent odds to call with some of his flushes. So we're aware when the river card comes that some flushes are going to be in his range. So because of that, we're just not going to make huge bets on the river. Our opponent's, if you're a good player and the flush gets there, it's not like you're going to spew off your stack when you had two pair or something on the river. You're just not going to do that. So it's okay to give your opponent a good price on the turn. You're not going to bet recklessly on the river when the draw gets there, but you will likely bet pretty big at a pretty high frequency when the draw does miss. So more on draws getting a good price. Furthermore, there just usually aren't all that many draws in the opponent's range. And if a small bet makes draws slightly more profitable, it's not a big deal. We want the most plus EV line versus whole range, not just his draws. People have gotten a lot better at poker in the last few years, but it's still a micro stakes leak that I've seen when I sort of answer hand histories in the micro stakes forum where people just are paranoid about giving the draw odds. And it's still something you see among even pretty good players where they just get too captivated on whether or not the draw has outs to call. Sometimes you're just going to give every draw in your opponent's range a plus EV call, but it's okay since his whole range isn't made of draws, and if you make his draws slightly more profitable, but weaken the EV of his really, really good hands, it's often worth it. So don't be results-oriented when your opponent tank calls a weakest draw on the turn and draws out. It will happen. Stuff goes down a lot when two players are playing close to optimally. So we've come to the boss fight, the final example. We open in the cutoff and the big blind calls. The flop comes 9 of heart, 8 of spade, 3 of spades. So what I'll do on this flop is I'll usually c-bet close to my entire range here in position. I might literally c-bet my entire range here. Since position is valuable and my range is stronger than the opponent's. He's calling in the big blind because he's getting like 2-1, slightly better than 2-1 immediate odds. But he's out of position and he overall got a flop, which is probably bad for his range. Excuse me. But since it's hard for the opponent to check call, I'll bet small and make his check raises less effective and force him to play the following street out of position with a wider range. So this is something, again, that I think is very important to do is you can bet smaller here because now, I know personally when I call from the blinds and I get a really, really wet and a low board, I'll end up check calling, but I always hate check calling on this board. There's not even a hand I like check calling here when I cold called from the big blind. So what I really like to do is I like to be able to check raise aggressively. I like to be able to check raise all my sets, check raise all my two pairs, check raise with some flush draws. Not all flush draws I don't mind check calling. But overall, I like check raising aggressively here since position is valuable and it's really hard to play the turn. But by betting small in position, it forces the opponent to check call wider and makes his check raises less effective. And when I say bet smaller on the flop, what I mean by that is if the pot's let's say 6 big blinds, which is about what it will be if you open to 2.5 in the cutoff or 3 in the cutoff. It's around 6 big blinds. Rather than c-bet 4.5 big blinds on the flop, I'd rather c-bet 3 big blinds on the flop. So rather than bet 75% of the pot, I think 50% of the pot's better. Again, both bet sizes will be profitable because your range is better than his and you have the advantage of position. I just think the smaller bet's overall better. So let's say the big blind calls our flop bet and the turn card comes the 7 of clubs and the flush does not get there. Should we overbet here? So pause for a moment and think if you'd want to overbet here. But I would say I don't think so. Because villain can probably have 3 combos of sets now for 7-7, 2 combos of 9-7 suited, and 16 combos of Jack-10. So whether or not he has 7-7 or 9-7 suited, or Jack-10 in his range, again, is gonna, or Jack-10 off, I should say. It's gonna depend on your pre-flop opening size as well as how big you c-bet the flop. But I think it's pretty reasonable for him to have a lot of those hands here, which makes me less interested in overbetting because, again, I want to overbet when my opponent won't have a raising range. Here, I think he'll have a raising range. So, So yeah, I don't think I'd really overbet here. That's a lot of strong hands, but by betting smaller on the turn here, we force our opponent to play a tough spot out of position on the river, as well as make his check raises less effective. So again, on this turn, if I'm going to bet, since I want to keep my positional advantage and I want to make my opponent have to defend sort of a wider range on the following street, I want to make his check raises less effective, I think a smaller bet on this turn is going to be fine. So again, I'd probably bet like 50% of the pot on the turn with a lot of my range, because I want his check raises to be less effective. I think he can have a whole lot of Jack-10 combos here. A lot of the hands I'm betting are not going to want to fold to a check raise, so it's also good if I bet smaller. It's a little bit easier to call the check raise sometimes based on our opponent's sizing. So I like betting smaller here, keeping my positional advantage, and if I am going to overbet, it'll be on the river when the river card's a blank. Granted, the small turn and bet does mean you'll have to play the river more often against a wider range. That's harder to do than betting the turn big. But it's way harder for the opponent. So since you're not both GTO robots, if you're equally skilled, he'll make more mistakes than you. And hopefully you're more skilled than him anyways. So this is, I think, one of the biggest mental leaks a lot of players have. I constantly see people take lines that are less plus EV than other lines, but the line they take is the easier line to play. That can sometimes be okay. But a lot of times you're thinking to yourself okay, I want to take this line because it's slightly easier to play my hand this way, but you're not realizing that you make your opponent's range way harder to play if you take the other line. So a lot of times the more profitable line will make both your life and your opponent's life tougher, but it makes your opponent's life way tougher. So going back to this, if I made a big bet on this turn, I think most people would be able to feel reasonably comfortable with folding a lot, then check raising their Jack-10s, their bluffs, and their sets. There's still be some hands that obviously don't want to face a big bet, like maybe pocket 10s if our opponent can have it, or a hand like ace-9 or king-9. But for the most part, it's kind of going to be easier for the opponent to play against our big bet because he can fold more often and his check raises are more effective. If we bet smaller, yeah, we're going to have to play the river more often and it's going to be tricky sometimes, but our opponent's going to have to play that river out of position, so it's way harder on him. So all I'm saying is, and I made a video called SSNL, You're Doing It Wrong, Part 1, and Part 2's similar. I don't know if Part 2's come out yet by the time that you're watching this video, but there are often more plus EV lines that are just harder to play, and just remember, it makes your opponent's life way tougher. So don't be afraid to take those lines. Additionally, the small bet sizing and position, often followed by a large river bet, is, in my best guess, closer to optimal on quite a few board textures. So be comfortable with the idea of betting small when you're in position so your opponent can't check raise very effectively. And then when you do that, if the following street blanks, be willing to make the larger bets with some hands in your range. So in other words, it's pretty common a small flop bet or turn bet is followed by a large bet on the next street. The small bet says, hey, I know you got a lot of strong hands, so I don't want to bet too big or else your raises will be too effective. But I also don't want to give free cards, and I want to get value, so I'm not going to check. Obviously, sometimes you can be bluffing as well, but this is, in general, what you're usually saying when you're value betting. And then the large bet on the following street says, well, you got a bad turn card for your, or you got let's say a river. You got a bad river card for your range, and you had to slow play on a really dangerous board for you to have my strong hands beat. I can now make a very large bet without giving you an incentive to slow play more hands on the previous street, because if you were to slow play, you not only risk me outdrawing you on the river, but you also risk the river card just killing your action. So that's kind of I think, the language behind the bet sizing when you make a smaller bet followed by a bigger bet. And again, this is just sizing that I'm using much more often now than I used to. Whereas back in the day, it was kind of when I bet 60% of the pot. Now it's I'm more often betting 40, 45, 50% of the pot and then following it up with the next sheet with a bet of 100% of the pot. So just, sometimes it's best to bet a medium-sized bet on all three sheets, but be aware you can take lines where you do small bets followed by a big bet. It's pretty common, I think. So that wraps up the video. I hope you enjoyed watching it, and I hope you learned a bunch. Feel free to ask me any questions or leave any comments in the forums. And I hope what you really took from this isn't I don't want people to start playing around with the formula and thinking they're going to get these super precise bet sizings. What I want people to do is have a much better feel, and now whenever they bet, consider different sizings. You need a reason now to bet 2/3 of the pot. It's not just whether or not you bet, check, or, call. That's limit. You're playing no limit. So you need to consider all the different bet sizes. And if you bet 65% of the pot, there needs to be a reason for it. A lot of times you're actually just straight up making a mistake if you're not betting 120% of the pot or 40% of the pot. So again, hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you learned a lot. This is kind of difficult stuff to apply, but hopefully it gets you thinking about what sort of bet sizing you should use in different spots. So thanks for watching, everyone. Take care. Bye.